Get out of here. Look, at some point in your strength training journey, you're probably going to need to lose some body weight. You're probably going to gain too much body fat, and it's time to rectify things and make time for a dedicated block where cutting body fat and body weight is your main goal. Now, this can go really well, and you can finish your cut leaner, hotter, and more metabolically healthy than ever before. Or it's going to go worse than ever. You can get smaller, weaker, and somehow, even though you've lost body weight, you're fatter than when you started. Today, we want to cut through the fat and get to the meat of the issue. We want to give you practical, useful advice on how you can keep as much muscle mass, strength, and sanity through this cutting block. We want you to do mostly higher volume training in your cut, and we've got a couple of good reasons for this. So the primary goal of this strength training block while you're cutting weight is to preserve as much muscle mass as possible. It's not to maintain as much strength as possible, and we have a good reason for that. When it comes to strength training, you have a couple of resources contributing to your maximum attempts, and one of the main drivers is muscle mass. And one of the main things at risk during a cut is your muscle mass. Your skill won't leave you, your neurological drive will come back when you're fresher, but your muscle mass can easily be lost, and we can very easily lose more muscle mass than we need. Now, you might have been led to believe that high intensity sets close to failure are the only way we can build muscle. This is patently not true. Higher volume training will build muscle. This is undeniable, and don't let anybody fool you. Now, the reason we want you to focus on higher volume training during a cut over higher intensity training as a strength training athlete is that caloric deficits and high weights fatigue us in two ways that will concern us. The first area is that heavy weights are more fatiguing than higher volume on your neural drive. Your neural drive essentially refers to your CNS's ability to send fast, strong signals from your brain through your spine and into your muscles. The more fatigued you are and the more heavy attempts you take, the more this ability is depleted. Guess what also depletes this ability? Caloric deficit. When we're reduced in energy, macro and micronutrients, our ability to have greater neural drive is reduced. And the combination of these makes for a very poor recipe at heavier weights. So when you're well fed, well rested, and your training is peaked for an event, your ability to express the most amount of neurological drive and lift the heaviest weights is at its maximum. However, when you're fatigued, when you're lower in calories, when you've taken too many heavier attempts, this is when you're at your worst. Now, this might be a problem in your regular strength training, but when our main goal shifts from high intensity attempts to preserving muscle mass, this becomes a little bit more of an issue. When a bodybuilder says to you, oh, we need to do high intensity training, when they're doing their machine plate press, when they fail on this doesn't make a difference. When you're doing a heavy back squat and you're trying to go for a heavy set of 8, for example, maybe it might be 180, 200 kilos, things become a lot more fraught with risk and don't really pay off in the long run, and certainly not in the short run for these sessions. Which brings us on to the second point from heavier weights that we want to stay away from when we're in a caloric deficit. For us, heavy weights are big lifts like the squat and the bench and the deadlift, and we don't want to be doing these heavy near intensity lifts when we're fatigued, when our neural drive is reduced, and when we're in a psychologically low state. This is absolutely going to make us at a greater risk for energy because the coordination that it takes on a heavy squat or a heavy bench or a heavy deadlift is much higher than a single isolation lift that these bodybuilders might be talking about when they're talking about high intensity training. So given that we're not going to be as sharp or as fresh, we're probably going to have a greater chance of hurting ourselves because the forces going through these joints are going to be very, very high because you're probably pretty strong. It makes sense for us to shift our intent to higher volume training. This higher volume training will give us the same stimulus, a different kind of fatigue in a different way, but it will still provide the stimulus to preserve muscle or maybe in some cases even grow some extra muscle. Now, not only is it slightly more dangerous for us to push this high intensity training when we're in a caloric deficit, but it's also going to really reinforce a quality of technique that we just do not want. When you're strength training and when you're in a caloric deficit, your ability to maintain good quality technique at these heavier weights is going to be reduced. We do not want to reinforce this worse quality technique when we simply don't need to. You're more than likely going to be able to have much better quality technique at slightly lower intensities, a little bit more manageable volume, but at a weight that allows you to express the technique you want while still getting the main goal of this training block, which again is preserving muscle mass and not necessarily worrying about our top end strength. So what exactly do we mean when we say higher volume? So when it comes to strength training, for most of you, most of your year is going to be approximately 4 to 5 sets of maybe 4 to 6 reps or slightly lighter. We could literally have one session done where we're doing one total rep. So when we talk about higher volume, I want you to shift closer on the spectrum to those higher volume bodybuilders, but not quite that whole way. So we're not down the end where we're talking about one maximal set of 6 to 8. I want you to shift on the other side of that spectrum to these higher volume bodybuilders. But wait, there's even more reasons we want you to do higher volume training or pushing towards the higher end of the volume when you're a strength training athlete. And that is simply, we're going to burn a little bit of extra calories. Now, the amount of calories you burn from gym work is modest, but it's not inconsequential. For a higher volume session, we could be looking at maybe 200, maybe even 300 calories extra per session, depending on how far you're pushing it, depending on how low your volume was before. Now, I know we're talking about NEAT being the main driver, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, for how many calories you burn, but I think we've lost track a little bit of the fact that if we're doing lots of training, more voluminous sessions, we are going to burn some extra calories. It's not going to be massive, it's not going to be an absolute game changer, but it is an important benefit when we're trying to maximize all our endeavors to lose as much fat as possible. But I've got another reason that I want you to focus on slightly higher volume training in your strength training, and that is to build work capacity. Now, you've heard us talk ad nauseum about the benefits of work capacity for strength training athletes, and I would highly encourage you to focus on that in your training. But when it comes to a cut, this is a fantastic opportunity, on top of the other reasons that we've looked at for high volume training, is to build some extra work capacity during this phase. And there's a good chance, if you've let yourself go a little bit, if you've gotten a little bit fatter than you would like or than you should have, there's probably a good chance that your work capacity isn't up to par. Building work capacity is pretty simple. We want to do more work per unit of time given, and we can do this in numerous different ways, but one of those is during our strength training sessions, where we do more work per set, and we maybe do more sets per session. We might even look at reducing the amount of time between those sets to condense down that work in a given time frame. Increasing your work capacity allows you to recover better between sets, between sessions, and on top of the fact that, again, it's going to assist in terms of your metabolic health and hopefully assist in a little bit of extra calorie burn. Now, there's another reason we want you to stay away from these heavy weights too often for too long, and that is back on the technique issue. This is something we don't hear talked about too often, and it's something that'll become very apparent to you when you're losing weight. So when you're heavier, you've got more muscle mass, you've got more fat tissue, your body feels really comfortable. And when I go to do a back squat, imagine that I have an extra 2 inches of hamstrings and ass and calf underneath me. My body loves the stability this provides from the proprioceptive feedback. Essentially, when my body touches itself, it feels really stable. I've got nice, stable joints. My range of motion is a little bit shorter, but a little bit stronger. But now, let's say I've lost 10, 15 kilos. I go to do a back squat. Suddenly things feel just a little bit more unstable. I've got a little bit more range of motion everywhere. I've got a little bit less stability. And for a period of weeks to months, my body's not going to be used to this new range of motion. I'm going to feel less stable, less confident, and my body's going to dampen that power output for just a little bit. So what I want you to take advantage of, because we've got these other great reasons to focus on this higher volume training, I want you to tailor back those slightly higher intensity weights for a while to give yourself an opportunity to focus on learning this new body so you have a better quality technique. And then as a result, when you go for those heavier weights, you're going to have the best technique possible and it's not going to surprise you. Now, to get a little bit more specific in terms of programming, there's essentially 3 different avenues that we could take this approach and see how it would look when it comes to programming during a cut. The first way you could do this is put a lot of that volume and most of your resources into higher volume main exercises. So maybe that's the squat, the bench, the deadlift, whatever your main barbell movements are, and you do most of your volume there, and you reduce the frequency and variety of assistance work that you're doing. Then you allow this bigger lift to take most of those training resources, and you see where you end up at the end of the block. The second option we can do is actually reduce a lot of that volume on the main exercises, and then we take that down to 4 or 5 sets of 3, maybe sets of 5 every so often, and keep the weights pretty moderate, somewhere between 70 to 80%. But then what you do is you take all of these extra resources from that lighter main movement training and do a metric fuck ton of volume and intensity on your isolation work. So you take your 45-degree seal rows and you go to town on these with that higher volume training and try and set new PBs. You're trying to look for your new max set of 10 on that seal row. Maybe it's your dumbbell bench, your quad extensions, your belt squats, whatever isolation exercise you feel are very, very useful to you and will build up your weak points and the areas that you want to look even better, and go to town on these exercises. Now, the third way, and it's a way a lot of people will use when they're cutting weight and running our programs on the Seek Strength app at app.seekstrength.com, is they'll reduce their max into the program at the start of the cut by 10, 15, or if you're cutting a lot of body weight, by maybe up to 20%. This way that those weights are tailored back ahead of time, and even though the app will adjust the weights for you, this will allow you to run these programs pretty effectively, knowing and compensating for the fact that you're going to be a little bit weaker temporarily. Oftentimes this might actually result in PBs, not as big a PB as if you're maintaining or gaining weight, but still this does happen on occasion. These options are all available to you, and all of them could make sense depending on your style and preference of training. All of them can work quite well as long as you're intelligent and purposeful with what you want to do. Now, I know this all sounds great and you're looking at me thinking, oh, but please, I love doing heavy weights. I promise you, if you make your main focus a hypertrophic effect, you're trying to maintain or preserve or even gain muscle mass during your cut, you will put yourself in a better place after the cut. Remember, the biggest thing at risk of being lost is your muscle mass. Your strength will deplete temporarily, but I promise you it will come back. And the best way to support that is maintain as much muscle mass as possible. Skill plus muscle mass is basically what gives us strength. And if you keep that muscle mass, the skill will come back. You will be stronger at the end of it. Now, moving on from strength training in the gym, the next most important thing I want you to do is some high intensity conditioning. Now, I specifically said high intensity conditioning for a couple of good reasons. If you've watched this channel before, you know we're big fans of high intensity conditioning and low intensity steady state conditioning at the right points in time. However, for this very specific purpose, a strength training athlete who's trying to preserve as much strength and muscle mass as possible at the end of a cut, I want you to put all of your eggs primarily into high intensity conditioning. Now, the main goal of this is simple. I want you to do as much high intensity interval training as you can do per week for the duration of the cut. For some of you, this might literally just be 1 to 2 sessions per week, depending on how fat you were, depending on how out of shape you were before you started this cut. For others, you might be reasonably well conditioned at the moment, and you might be able to add in a third session of high intensity interval training in this section. Look, low intensity steady state cardio is great for so many things, but HIIT in this scenario is an absolute no-brainer. So high intensity interval training obviously burns more calories per minute than compared to less. But there's also this after effect of high intensity interval training or high intensity cardio that we get known as EPOC, or exercise post oxygen consumption. This basically means that that metabolic rate is a little bit higher and you burn slightly more calories after training. Now again, like the higher volume training, this isn't going to get you absolutely ripped every session. You're not going to turn into a metabolic furnace like you're taking Clen and DMP, but the effects are modest and still present. You'll still burn just a little bit more calories after every session than you would if you had just done some steady state cardio. Again, if we're getting a combination of all these will add up to maybe an extra few rice cakes per day, and that'll make all the difference when you're really hungry. Now, normally when we compare high intensity interval training with low intensity steady state cardio, people will say you'll burn the same amount of calories because you'll be doing a 10-minute HIIT session compared to 60 minutes on a bike. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about 20 to 30 minutes of high intensity training. A great protocol that I've been using with myself and a lot of athletes recently is the Norwegian 4x4. It's essentially a 10-minute warm-up at about 60% of your max heart rate. Then you do 4 rounds dispersed by 3 minutes rest, where the 4 rounds you do for 4 minutes, you do 90 to 95% of your max effort or heart rate. It's very tough, but it's incredibly effective. Now, there's another reason I want you as a strength training athlete to focus on high intensity training, and that's the fact that you're probably not very well conditioned currently. So there's an assumption we make when we compare low intensity versus high intensity work, and that's the fact that you can do a reasonable output for that full 50 to 60 minutes on the low intensity work. This, however, probably isn't the case for a lot of you watching this. If you're not very well conditioned, you won't be able to do a meaningful amount of work for that full hour. However, when we're doing HIIT or high intensity training, we are guaranteed a certain output because we're going to be going to near maximal intensity. This will put you in a much better fitness condition compared to low intensity work, which will take several months for you to accrue gains versus several weeks from high intensity interval training. Okay, let's just do 1 or 2 notes on the cut before we finish the video. One of the main things I want you to think about when you're doing your cut, if time allows, is we're generally fans of slower to moderate cuts. We essentially want you to go almost as slow as possible while still making meaningful results on losing body weight. Typically what we see is this preserves the most amount of muscle mass and sanity for the lifter when they're doing slower cuts. Fast, aggressive cuts make you feel terrible and often compromise more muscle mass than we need to. Now, there's one nutrition tip that I want to talk about in this particular video, and that is something we found is pretty useful for a lot of people, ourselves included. And that is restriction of carbs to before and after training. Now, this isn't really a metabolic trick. The effects of carb timing and nutrient timing across the week generally don't make a massive difference. The main reason we want to use this particular trick is the psychological effects. There's a case for a lot of us that if we have already gotten too fat, we've probably lost a little bit of our psychological control and discipline around food. And while calories are one of the main things that are going to affect our body composition, they're the be all and end all essentially. However, if we're following a macro split and we've split our carbs out across the day, we're probably not going to have a whole lot of carbs. And what can often happen for a lot of us is that we'll start off with our breakfast and we'll say, oh yeah, I've got 3 meals, I'll put 50 grams of carbs per meal. And then suddenly after training, you've had your 3 meals and you've got no carbs left. What often happens here is we sneak a little bread, a little bit of toast, a little bit of yogurt, but you start putting Nutella on your yogurt for some reason because you're a fatty. And in this case, we've kind of lost psychological control. But what we find effective is that if we put this hard obstacle in front of carbs before, carbs after training, and carbs nowhere else, we give ourselves a good opportunity to regain a little bit of that dietary control, and it ensures that there's no kind of waving in between the lines where we're like, no, I can split the carbs out, knowing full well that you're going to eat more carbs again later. When we do this carbs before and after, we put ourselves in a position where it's a hard line and it gives ourselves the best opportunity for success. Now, if you're looking for programs to run during your cut, and lots of people have run these programs, I want you to go to the Seek a Strength app, app.seekastrength.com, and you'll find a plethora of strength training based programs that will absolutely blow your results out of the water. Check it out, the link down below.